the topic on a firsthand basis. First of all, a lot of thanks to Michael Garcia for filling in for his sick boss, Representative Matt Shaheen. Mr. Garcia is the Chief of Staff to State Representative Shaheen. He's worked on Capitol Hill in D.C. He's worked for a president. Dare I ask which one? George W. Bush. Okay, you looked young enough that I was fearful that it might be a different answer, and I was going to wonder why you're joining us here today. Not that anyway, good to hear who you work for. He's also worked at the Texas State House and the Texas State Senate, and recently got your law degree. Yes. Have you passed the bar? Yes. You passed the bar as well. Sorry to put you on the spot, but okay. So, someone who's perhaps at the other end of the legal spectrum, Roger. Not saying that you're old. I'm just saying you're experienced. Roger Borgelt. For those of you who've been attending policy orientations, you'll see that Roger is a fixture at TPPF events, not just at policy orientation. We always appreciate his participation. He has 20 years experience in the practice of environmental, energy, and utility law prior to entering private practice in 2006. He served as Deputy Chief Consumer Protection Division in the Office of the Attorney General, and then as an Assistant Attorney General, where he defended consumer interests in the area of deceptive trade practices and represented major public entities. He has a lot of civil litigation experience and appellate practice focused on environmental, energy, land use, regulatory, property, local government, annexation, zoning, and permitting issues. And perhaps importantly, I think in this instance, because we're going to talk about perhaps the morality or ethics of doing taxpayer-funded lobbying, he's provided a fair amount of ethics advising and campaign finance advice as well. So what I'd like to do is first of all say, for those of you who follow TPPF and how we try to do these panels, we always try to find people on the other side of the aisle to participate. And you'll notice that perhaps that wasn't the case today, because we have two people who are skeptics of taxpayer-funded lobbying, and I've done some research on the matter as well. Let me just say at the onset, it wasn't for lack of trying. We probably contacted in excess of 20 lobbyists who were paid for by cities and counties and municipal utility districts and school districts, and invited them to come and make their case. And they all decided that they would rather do something else on a Thursday morning than be here. So we tried. And so the next thing I would ask for your forbearance on is I'm going to try my best to try to represent some of the arguments on the other side. Don't hate me for this. I think it's important that we kind of have a full discussion about why this issue needs to be discussed and be brought out into the daylight, and why perhaps there needs to be some reform. So let me preface the discussion by saying that I did an analysis of taxpayer-funded lobbying in the last legislative session with the reports that went up almost to the very end of session, so there may have been some additional funds expended. You can get a copy. I think perhaps the copy is on your table, right? Very good. You'll see that so far as I could tell, and again, there was probably some additional money that was spent by the end of session, but I found about $41 million of your tax money that was spent by different layers of government in Texas to influence the votes of the Texas House and the Texas Senate to, in a general sense, do what? To generally enlarge the power, enlarge the budgets, enlarge the taxing authority of our state, our local jurisdictions. So this is your tax money being spent to enlarge government at the local level, as a general rule. 41 million. It's a decent amount of money. And so the question is, should this even be done? Because what we're talking about here, by the way, are not government employees. We're talking about people who have been contracted often attorneys, but sometimes former lawmakers, people who are lobbyists, people who have lobbying companies. They have been paid for by taxpayer money to help represent the interests of those taxpayer entities before the legislature. So with that as kind of the entree, Roger, I know that you are a fixture in local politics, almost like a Don Quixote figure, right? So you've got
in Austin,
yeah,
yes.
In Austin, yes, specifically. What's the city council as far as liberal to conservative ratio?
It's 10 to 1 right
10
now.
10 to 1.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are long odds. It's kind of like at Thermopylae or something, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
Okay. So 10 to 1 odds, and you're often battling the city of Austin and what it's trying to do. How have you run across, what's your impression about taxpayer-funded lobbying?
Well, I want to tell you, I guess, and it's instructive and it's maybe a preview of coming attractions because there's actually a panel later today on this specific issue. But my experience during the called session and the last regular session was extremely instructive in dealing with the attempts at annexation reform, because what we had there was essentially, if you look at the committee lists, and I went back and reviewed them for testimony at the House and Senate committee hearings on the annexation reform bill, both regular and called session, you had virtually every single, I'll call them real person who testifying in favor of the annexation reform bill. You had very few people testifying in opposition, and those that were almost 100% either lobbyists representing cities or staff members of city governments. It's important, you had very few actual mayors and council members, maybe 1 or 2. It was mostly the staffs of the city governments testifying, or paid lobbyists, or paid Texas Municipal League, association sorts of people. So when you look at the opposition to that bill, the very people who are, testifying in favor of it, most of whom did not have lobbyists, they just came and showed up by the busload to testify in favor of the bill. I happen to represent a couple of HOAs who were wealthy enough that they could afford to have a lobbyist, that could work for them. But you had these city officials hiring lobbyists and their association, and they're all using taxpayer money from the very taxpayers who, if you polled them, would have said, we support this bill, but they're there opposing it. They managed to get it killed in the 2015 session and the 2017 regular session, and we finally get it passed in the called session, and the opposition to the bill is almost entirely taxpayer funded. And what does that say about our system of government, I think? That you've got the people who are elected, who are supposed to be representing the will of the people, hiring lobbyists who are opposing that will at the Capitol to the extent that they can get legislation killed session after session after session. I think that it seems to me it's one thing if a mayor or a council member want to show up and educate themselves and testify, and they're the duly elected representatives of the people. If they want to come down there and do that, that's fine. But to take tax money from these cities and spend it to kill legislation, to me, it at the very least ought to be disclosed, as was proposed in the legislation that failed. I saw it as, and obviously didn't turn out to be an insurmountable barrier, and I think we'll hear more about that if you want to go to this afternoon's panel, but I mean, it created a huge barrier to have almost the entire organized lobby opposing this legislation, and almost all of it hired by cities.
Interesting. Uncle, you're chief of staff, right? Mm-hmm. So to a certain extent, I'm guessing that you're playing a role in advising your boss, State Representative Shaheen, about the sort of level of intensity of public support for or against different measures, probably even have some influence about who's seeing him and how much time he's spending with people.
Sure.
What's your impression about the lobby in general, and in particular then people who have been paid by state entities, local entities, on not only the annexation issue, but other issues that come before the legislature.
Sure. First of all, I would like to apologize on behalf of Rep. Shaheen. He wanted all of y'all to know he's very sorry. He came down with the flu. So I found out I was doing this yesterday afternoon, so for what that's worth. But to your question, I actually have a really funny story, because I'll meet with these lobbyists as well, and I try not to beat around the bush, right? We'll get right to it and say, we're against what you're for. And Representative Shaheen had filed a bill that would have increased ballot transparency when a political subdivision wanted to issue a bond. So during a bond election, our bill would have required that all of the local debt currently taken out would be available on the ballot to the person voting. Also, how long it would take to pay off the debt that they're approving.
That was a fine measure, by the way. I think we like that measure.
We didn't see anything wrong with it, but some of, I'm not going to name any names, because they're all really great people, honestly, but I get this idea that they don't really believe what they're advocating for, because in one candid conversation I had with one lobbyist, I said, why would you be against ballot transparency? And he said, the ballot's not the place to educate voters. I say, well, if we say it is, then it is, right? We're the legislature, and this is what the people want. What is your real reason? And he said, Mike, I'm just afraid that if they know how much debt we've taken out, that they're not going to vote for the bond. I said,
A rare
exactly.
moment of candid.
Yeah. So I don't really even know what I think this is a nationwide trend that has really taken hold of the country, not just here in Texas. I mean, this is all over the country. And other entities see lobbyists hire people, so then they want to hire people, and it's kind of like a lobbyist arms race. And that's why we keep on seeing more and more being hired and more money being hired. You said it was 30 or 41 million, 2017. I believe 2015 was 29 million. So that's an increase of $12 million over just one session. So,
Interesting. Well, let me offer a counter argument to it. I could certainly say, as a former representative, and I'm sure your boss is the same way, that if any elected official within your jurisdiction calls, I'm going to guess that they're going to get through to Representative Shaheen pretty quickly, right?
absolutely.
So that avenue of representative government is likely open with pretty much all offices, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
And how often do you get phone calls, though, from those elected officials on issues?
Almost daily during session.
Okay, so you do get, the lines of communication are open and you're talking to them. So,
exactly.
But to provide an argument on the other, a couple of arguments I'd like you to address. First of all, assuming that there's a bill that says public taxpayer money can't be paid to hire professional lobbyists, wouldn't that simply result in people being assigned the task of being a legislative liaison and being paid as a staffer? I mean, wouldn't that happen anyway?
Sure. So that would happen. So there's that debate between the difference between a government relations person and a lobbyist, right? I think, and I'm not really speaking on behalf of Rep. Shaheen here because we haven't talked about that particular question, but I view them as one and the same. There's no right for taxpayer money to be used on behalf of governmental entities. Governmental entities certainly have a right to lobby the legislature, but they don't have a right to use taxpayer money to lobby the legislature. I was looking at the Texas Constitution last night, and one of the first sentences in the preamble is that all of the political power in Texas is invested in the people, not in municipal governments, not in counties. And when governmental entities have the ability to lobby, that puts them at a distinct advantage over citizens who don't have government funds to go to Austin, right? But that's the thing, you don't need to go to Austin to tell your representative what your feeling on a bill is. We take our school, our ISDs, our local governments, we take their concerns very seriously. Most of the time we're not in alignment with them. But we do listen to their arguments, and them coming into the Capitol multiple times per day doesn't really influence our way of thinking on the issue any more than it would if we just had a simple phone call.
So Roger, I'll ask you the question. Let's assume that the legislature has before it a bill that would prohibit public funds from being used to pay lobbyists. Then to address Michael's point, would you then say, what would happen if the bill was even more prescriptive and said, local government can't, for example, hire government relations people? But wouldn't the local entity still just say to somebody like some administrator, hey, during session, we expect that you're going to work 80% of your time, working with the legislature? I mean, how could you stop that?
Well, I think you're getting at a critical issue here in terms of what the real crux of the issue here is, and that is hiding how you're spending the money or attempting to hide how you're spending taxpayer funds.
Governments hide how money is spent?
Yes, I know. Isn't that amazing? So, if you've got a government relations person on your staff for your city or ISD or whatever, that's in the city's budget. At some level, that's being disclosed. That's an FTE. That's something that has to be budgeted and paid for. Whoever is electing that city's government can see that budget, look at it, can complain if they feel like the city is spending too much money on employees who are spending half their time in Austin or whatever. The situation with the lobbyists is that you're taking money that's not yours. It's by definition taxpayer money. And you're taking it and you're spending it on an outside lobbyist who knows where or how that even shows up in the city's budget,
right,
or if it may show up months or years after the fact. And it wasn't the decision of the people of that municipality or school district or whatever to spend hundreds or thousands or, as you just said, we're now up to $41 million on outside lobbying.
Right.
And so to me, it's a moral issue, and it's also an issue of, if we're going to spend money this way, then let's disclose it at the very least. And I think, the legislation, quite frankly, that passed the Senate this last session did a nice job, and it did make it all the way through the Senate. For whatever reason, it died in the House. A lot of really good stuff died in the House. We got to fix that. But anyway, it made it through, and it would have required that disclosure that I'm talking about.
Let me pose another question, though. Again, trying to provide an argument for at least allowing local governments to hire their own people to do this. So if you're a lobbyist, if you're a private contractor lobbyist, isn't it true that a lot of lobbyists have connections to trade associations or other big companies and end up directing some campaign funds to elected officials and perhaps even things like the occasional golf game or steak dinner?
Absolutely, yeah.
So that happens. Okay, so right. Wouldn't you think, okay, so I know that local governments certainly can't do that, right? So local governments aren't paying for the steak dinner or the golf game, and they're certainly not directing, one would presume, campaign contributions, although they do have quite a few contractors that work for cities that might be persuaded to support different people. But,
right.
But let's assume that doesn't happen. Wouldn't you rather want an honest government bureaucrat trying to make the case for that city or county before the legislature than some lobbyist who's getting paid $500,000 a year and is writing campaign checks? I mean, isn't that a more honest and transparent way to do it?
It absolutely is, and there's certainly a lot more control over what a city employee ethically can and cannot do than there is over what a lobbyist can and cannot do. So
it might be a step in the right direction, but it isn't going to end the problem.
I don't think you can absolutely prohibit, and Michael was getting to this point, they hear from their constituent cities and school districts all the time. Those folks, whether it's mayors, council members, school superintendents, whatever, they're going to call their state representatives, they're going to call their state senators.
Right.
And I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't be able to do that. The issue is when they come in and sort of upend the playing field, as they did, and I'm going to get back to my annexation example, where you've literally got the paid lobbyists in the back rooms, and a lot of them didn't ever testify at the hearings because the testimony was so much in favor of this bill that they didn't bother to show up to testify against it. They just worked their connections in the back rooms to try to get it killed.
And it seemed to have worked a little. Michael, what do you think about that?
Well, I think this issue would be a little bit different if there wasn't such a big difference between the lobbyists and the people of Texas, right? So, I mean, let's look at Senate Bill 2, right, which would have allowed the property rollback rate to be lowered. I don't think I had a single call from any private citizen that opposed that bill. Everybody was in favor of that bill because everybody wants their property taxes lowered. If you look at the ratio between local governments who testified in favor of that bill, in favor, as opposed to those who testified in opposition, the ratio is almost 100 to 1. I mean, it's mind-blowingly. You have to look at the witness list for Senate Bill 2. It's 16 pages, and 2 pages are your citizens who can afford to come to Austin and testify in favor of the bill, and then the rest of the 14 pages are sheriffs, mayors, county government officials, and lobbyists, right? And they're all coming up here on the taxpayers' dime, and they're all in opposition to what the taxpayers seem to want. So I don't think I would be for this issue if it was different, just because I have a principled opposition to taxpayer-funded lobbying. But I would definitely give the other side a little bit more credibility if it wasn't so lopsided.
So here's another argument. Let me maybe pierce this argument even before I make it, just because it grates against me so much to even advance it, but I'll try. So we hear, of course, people talk about states' rights, and I don't really particularly like that phrase because governmental entities don't have rights, people have rights. Governmental entities have powers, right? So it's perhaps more proper to say, state powers or governmental entity powers, right? So setting that aside, couldn't you argue that the fundamental process of lobbying is, by another name, petitioning redress of grievances? And if we as individuals have the right to do that, if corporations have the right to do that, if associations of people, through whether it's a PAC, a political action committee, or a labor union, we all have that ability to express our opinion. So why shouldn't the city of Austin have that ability?
We're not trying to ban the city of Austin from lobbying. We're just trying to ban the city of Austin from using taxpayer money for lobbying.
Well, how is that any different? Couldn't you make the argument, though, that if ExxonMobil wants to spend $3 million to try to influence a piece of legislation, who are you to then say that the city of Austin can't spend money to argue against that same?
Okay. Break. Time for a constitutional law lesson.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
So here's what we've got.
Now remember, don't hate me. I'm just trying to pretend
Here's
like
what we've got. We've got the states that created the United States under the Constitution.
I'm with you.
It's a compact of states, and so the federal government has certain powers. The remaining powers are reserved to the states.
Do you want a job at the foundation, by the way? This is sounding pretty good so far.
Texas is a state.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you following me
Yeah,
so far?
I am.
So Texas has a constitution, and under the Constitution, Texas can create, if it wants to, political subdivisions. And whatever powers those political subdivisions have, including, the People's Republic of Austin or whatever, school districts, whatever, the state gets to decide what those powers are. And if the state doesn't want its political subdivisions using money to lobby the legislatures, then the state has the right to decide that.
All right. That sounded pretty crisp. Let me advance one more argument. I'm not done yet here. I'm hoping that I wouldn't have done a better job than if we had invited one of these lobbyists to come and advance it. But what about the argument of corporate memory? So you've got different local elected officials, many of whom cycle through office quickly. A lot of them are basically volunteer positions. They don't get paid a lot of money. They're serving their community. Maybe they don't know that the origin of a bad idea that was a poorly thought out bill maybe 10 years ago and was shot down for certain reasons, they don't have the time to study all this stuff. They're running the hardware store in their local town while serving on the independent school district. Don't they need some firepower to represent their interests? Or, otherwise maybe, if you're from a rural school district, for example, maybe the urban school districts with more resources are going to eat their lunch. So how can we protect these jurisdictions who don't necessarily have the talent unless they hire it? I'm looking at you.
I am of the personal belief, and I think Rep. Shaheen would agree with me on this, that your advocate in Austin is the person you elected to advocate for you in Austin. Sorry. So you have to depend on your legislator to.
All right. Let's work through it, I guess.
You have to depend on your legislator to know these issues deeply, and to coordinate with different entities, private entities, that also inform us on these things. I mean, for every public entity that lobbies, there's a private entity that has the same position. So to me, it's kind of repetitive, right? I mean, why are we spending taxpayer money on something that the market is already spending money on?
Yeah, and I think, the taxpayers elected their school board or their mayor or city council or whatever to represent them in local issues. If there's some issue that's big enough that they need to come to Austin about it, they can come to Austin about it.
Or pick up the phone.
Yeah.
So let me advance another challenge with proscribing this behavior and trying to shut it down. There's likely an analogous tool in Texas from what I witnessed in California, and this is the following. There are trade journals that exist within the public space. So for example, there are trade journals that serve school boards or school superintendents or cities or counties. And these trade journals are read by few people, but they're chock full of advertisements for entities that offer goods and services to those levels of government. Mm-hmm. And what you'll find is that the advertising rates for that are through the roof. They're not particularly proportional to the eyeballs that read it. And what I'm aware of in other states is that money from the vendors to the cities and counties is then used by the association that runs that magazine to help fund their lobbying effort. And technically, that's not public money. So if you say the city of Austin can no longer pay for a lobbyist, what is then to stop the Texas Municipal League from selling ad space at $500,000 a pop in their trade journal magazine and then having that fund a lobbyist? Doesn't that just result in the same process? And isn't it more corrupt?
We're only talking about private funds being used, right?
We're talking about private funds being used from companies and individuals that sell goods and services to cities that are then paid for those goods and services with public money.
So it's not private money.
Well, I think what you're talking about is the dues that cities pay to be members of these associations, and there probably needs to be some disclosure of that. I think a lot of disclosure resolves a lot of these issues. And again, going back to the Senate bill, that's kind of what the Senate bill got to, was let's disclose how all of this money is being spent and flowed so that the taxpayers back home can actually see what's going on. Because if they see what's going on, they might decide to elect different people who won't do this. If
they might decide to elect different people.
Yeah,
oh my goodness.
They might.
So going back to the research from the last session where we found that it was about $41 million, and again, that was money spent with the last reporting period. There may be additional funds that were allocated through the special session or things that were spent.
There were definitely funds allocated in the special session.
Yes, so 41 million is probably a low estimate, maybe 50 or $60 million. It still, though, only amounted to roughly 11% of the money spent to lobby the legislature last year. Couldn't you argue that cities and counties and school districts need to have a seat at the table? And if the private industry is spending 89%, who's to begrudge the Austin Independent School District from spending $500,000 to lobby?
It gets back to whose money they're spending. If they were spending their own money, I wouldn't have a problem with it. They're spending taxpayer money, and taxpayers have a right to at least know about that. And if the state wants to prohibit it being done that way, the state can prohibit it being done that way. But at a very minimum, we need to at least know that our governmental entities are spending money in this manner so that we have a check on it.
I also think that argument's kind of predicated on an assumption that if you spend more money to get before a legislator, then you're more likely to get your bill passed. And maybe that's the case for other offices, but it's certainly not the case for ours. So the idea that 89% of the private industry is spending this money, but municipalities and local governments are not, doesn't really change the legitimacy of the argument in our mind at all.
Well, this has been an interesting discussion. I'd like to hear from the audience now. I understand we've got someone with a microphone, and so what I would appreciate is a couple of things. First of all, wait for the mic to show up, and I'll pick on you when I see your hand. So we've got one hand here. The next thing is, I would very much like to hear who you are, and if you're with anyone in particular, if you're just here on your own, just say your name. And then please make it a question and not a campaign stump speech. Thank you. So right over here first.
Do you want them to disclose if they're taxpayer-funded lobbyists?
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah, we'll see.
I'll start it off. My name is David Keller. So could the legislature just show some leadership, some personal responsibility, even without a law? And an effective way of dealing with this is have elected officials just refuse campaign contributions from the lobbyists, so therefore they would negate their influence in those offices potentially. So maybe make a pledge that you won't accept campaign donations from a lobbyist that's representing one of these organizations, and show leadership even without law.
I'm not opposed to that.
Yeah.
Of course, I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of Rep. Shaheen, but if I know him, I think he would agree with that as well.
That's certainly one way of dealing with it, I agree.
So it's an interesting question, and I think there's a challenge, though. When I was in office, I had raised the most amount of money from people actually in my district relative to lobbyists out of the 120 lawmakers in California. But that having been said, it's a very competitive process. And if you're unilaterally disarming in the face of what could be primary opposition or a tough election, the challenge is that if only a couple of people take that pledge, you may find yourself at a disadvantage, and then the irony of course, is that you can hold your very pure feelings as a private citizen in the future because you won't be returned to office. And I'm reminded of one of the sayings attributed to Thomas Jefferson, the first order of a statesman is to get elected. So just as a countervailing thought on that, just not saying one thing or another, but all right, so next question, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is George Williams. I'm a physician anesthesiologist from Houston with the Texas Society of Anesthesiologists. But I'm asking a question as an individual because I'm in my city of Bel Air, Texas. I volunteer on the Environmental Sustainability Board, and we help make policy just to make sure people can know about recycling and it financially benefits the city and those sorts of things, and everyone's safe. So this would actually be pertinent to us because one thing that sometimes we actually are looking at, recommending policies to city government that could actually, help in that and consistent with our mission. But on the same token, I found that sometimes city government can be kind of boggy. Even though it's very local, it takes a lot of time. There's enormous amounts of discussion and sending things back to boards and going back and forth. And so, for individuals like us, like when we actually have people that are citizens and volunteering, and I'm practicing taking care of patients throughout the week, I have no way to actually communicate. Has there ever been a consideration of for lack of a better term, a hotline or some clear way? Okay, this city just said something to the legislature so that not only what resource we're using, but what we actually say is public. Because even if you actually have a staff person, in the city calling the legislature, you don't know exactly what conversation actually occurred. There's not a transcript of it. The only thing we can actually directly communicate would be something that's passed and voted on. So has there been consideration of something like that, making that transparent, making that public? Thank you.
Interesting question about transparency and about people who are paid for by your money, representing your interests properly before the legislature.
Well, I think you've hit on one of the constraints of only being able to be in session for 140 days, right? Because it's not just individuals such as yourself, even our constituents, we're not able to talk to all of them for as long as they would like, right? Every once in a while I have to say, I'm sorry, I have other people I need to talk to. And I wish I didn't have to do that, but when you have time constraints like that, it's just a reality of the situation. So I'm not sure if there is a way to fix that other than to go on the yearly schedule as other states do, and I don't think we'd want to do that in Texas.
Yeah, I'm not sure Texas is ready for that. I will say, in terms of cities having influence or being able to contact the legislature, I know for a fact, because I was told this by several legislators who I will not name, that the mayor of Austin was in direct contact with members of the legislature over the annexation bill that I've been talking about, and made several phone calls. And so there is certainly, and this isn't in the realm of taxpayer-funded lobbying, but city officials, if they want to get engaged, they have the wherewithal to engage. So.
Well, and one would argue, though, that's a proper role
Exactly.
in a representative form of government, right? You want to hear from.
I have no problem with it.
Right.
My point was that the cities can be engaged without resorting to the taxpayer-funded folks.
Right,
Yeah.
if they want to pick up the phone and make that call. Sir, just behind you, yes, right over here, and if you wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Sparks, and I do happen to sit on City Council at Midland, and I'm against taxpayer-funded lobbying. But there's nothing, there would be nothing prohibiting if the City Council wanted to lobby for something, to say to some of our constituents, if you will raise money under your organization, whatever organization that is, they could hire a lobby for as citizens. But I am against, and I think it's the wrong thing to do. That is really neat.
Almost sounds like you're out at an oil patch or something right there. Man, I hope they find something.
But I do think that using taxpayer money for a lobby is just wrong, because you can get some of your constituents to form a group and let them raise the money, let them hire the lobby, and they can go in and say, that's what the citizens of Midland want, or at least that's what our group wants.
Right. Yes.
Thank you.
Right, there, sorry about that.
Forgive me, I tied up my business calls, and if I've already covered all of this, I apologize. But one of the concerns I've had is kind of the deep swamp thing, particularly in independent school districts, where the bureaucracy in the school system are paid by our tax money, and they spend their time lobbying for the voters to do bond issues in their favor, lobbying for all kinds of other things with the legislature or whatever. And I recall in my years in policy staff of the federal government, this was years ago before the deep swamp thing became so bad, the Hatch Act was a strong constraint. You know, most people that I was working with didn't do those sort of things. Your comments?
Well, that's an interesting, of course, the Hatch Act is at the federal level, right?
Right.
And so what the Hatch Act basically says is that if you're a federal employee, other than, for example, if you're Senate-confirmed position, right, they have certain exceptions, that you're not allowed to use your official office to try to, participate in political activity. That's mostly, of course, dealing with elections. What we're talking about here, of course, is lobbying efforts, which are, similar but different from that.
It's distinguishable.
Yeah. So is there potential for something like that at in the state of Texas to prescribe behavior?
I'd be surprised if we didn't already have something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we already prohibit, state employees, which is mostly what's looked at by the legislature, from, testifying for or against legislation. So,
State agencies
yeah,
as well,
right.
yeah. Yeah, they're all.
They can only provide testimony on the legislature,
correct.
right? So in other words, it's more like informational. Like if you did this, then this will happen, or this will happen, and
Sometimes you can figure out what side they're on.
Yeah.
yeah, they can figure out ways around it. Okay,
I've,
what
I've
a
actually
surprise.
usually been able to figure out which side they're on, actually.
I think we got someone in the back there, although it looks like you've got, pardon me, go ahead with this. All right, thank you. Sorry about that.
So I just had a question. It's a constitutional law question. The Supreme Court has held that compelling someone to contribute to political speech that they disagree with raises significant First Amendment concerns. Considering that taxes are compelled contributions, do you think that taxpayer-funded lobbying also raises significant First Amendment concerns?
Yes, yes is the short answer, and we can discuss that more after.
There you go. Yes.
I've actually heard the argument from the other side saying that restricting taxpayer-funded lobbying would be a violation of a city's First Amendment right. And,
Right. That's the problem,
that's
right?
Sort of, that's what you got.
Sir, behind Adam, didn't you have a question though? No? Okay, so then we'll go to Adam next. This is going to be on your podcast, Adam. Notice he didn't answer the question. You better answer well.
So we've mentioned annexation, we've mentioned property taxes, we've mentioned ballot transparency during bond elections. I think, seeing this is a TPPF event, we could also throw school choice into the mix. Do you guys want to comment on the degree to which taxpayer-funded lobbying is a gatekeeper issue to a lot of other things we want to do?
Well, that's an interesting question. Okay, so let's absorb what he just asked, because I think it's kind of a big deal. So by being a gatekeeper issue, in other words, is what the questioner suggesting is that taxpayer-funded lobbying is inherently tipping the scale toward bigger, more expansive government with more taxes? Do you see that as an issue?
I think it's clearly true in the school choice debate, with the school districts and their associations doing everything they can possibly do to oppose school choice, including primarying a bunch of legislators this go round. And I also think it was, again, not to beat a dead horse, but it was huge in the annexation bill in terms of trying to protect the status quo for the large cities in Texas. They did not want to give up their unilateral powers, and they were absolutely going to do everything they could, and did do everything they could to keep that from happening to them. So yes.
I would imagine that's the case, like I said earlier, for some offices, but there's no such thing as a gatekeeper in our office, right? If you're a constituent, then you're number one, and if you're not, we'll consider what you have to say, but not as much as we consider what constituents have to
I
say.
think the question was more institutionally, though. I don't think he was talking about specific offices, but almost like it's a roadblock.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and until more people adopt the outlook that our office has, I don't think it's going to change.
Right down here next to Adam. And then we'll go in the back
Staying
next.
with school choice and the entire argument there, I'm more concerned with the way our ISDs will use even their website to drive parents, particularly parents with their special needs children or whatever. Like when we were talking about the education was going to be cut because of the budget, they sent the poor special needs children in there to face our legislators and say, oh, please don't cut education, I'll lose my teacher. And I mean, you know, to me, that's an immoral use of these children anyway, and I kind of am unhappy with the parents that would do it. But they do it on their websites. When you interview the trustees before the elections, you know, they'll sit there and say, well, there's nothing we can do. Our hands are tied by both all the unfunded mandates from the federal government and also from the state. And yet, I don't see anything stopping them from getting people out to fight school choice. And it's that use of the money and the way they use it as a roadblock there as well.
It's definitely an issue. I was talking to somebody yesterday, I forgot who it was around here, who was saying that their child came home from school and in their take-home folder they had a big flyer, vote for the bond, right? Now I don't know if that would officially qualify as lobbying the legislature, right? But it still is a concerning action that happens a lot here in the state, and I think it's something we need to look at.
Yeah, I've seen evidence of certainly what is borderline electioneering activity by school district employees. Absolutely. It's certainly in Austin, and I'm sure it occurs in other parts of the state.
Third row from the back. Maybe it's the second row from the back. There you go.
So Wisconsin got out of the business of taking union dues out of public sector union. They can still have unions in public sector, but they got out of the dues business. And in Wisconsin, they're doing more reforms because of that, because they basically defunded their opposition. Texas, public sector unions are growing faster in Texas than any other state. What's your view on Texas got back in the union business in I think 2005. What's y'all's view on that? Would that help?
So that's an interesting question. I think the way I'd like to try to reframe that is if you were talking about government employee associations that are labor unions, might those associations end up being proxies by and large for local entity lobbying? Because, you know, how are those interests really separated? Is that something that Texas should look at, is looking at some of those reforms passed in Wisconsin?
Well, they're essentially not separated. They would have almost identical interests to, say, the Texas Municipal League if you're looking at municipal employees. So I think you have to do away with mandatory union dues, one, and two, what is it? Disclosure is the great disinfectant. I mean, whatever is being contributed by these cities to their associations or by school districts, we all need to know that. We all need to know what that number is and where those dollars are coming from.
Yeah, I agree. I really don't have too much to contribute other than what you said, but I always joke around. Every session, the Texas State Employees Union comes around and tries to badger me into joining, and I always joke that I'm going to join and lobby for decreased salaries for employees of the state of Texas, so, you know, to save the government money. Yeah.
There you go. I think it's important to for Texans to understand something that I have found perhaps one of the naive blind spots for typically optimistic Texans. As a political refugee from the Golden State, I cannot emphasize enough that the gateway to power for people who want to increase taxes in government is organized labor, and that the main beachhead that's going to be accomplished in the Lone Star State is through government unions. And I have been dumbstruck by the fact that the majority party in Texas has largely been unaware of this threat. They don't seem to grasp that this is how armies are mobilized to win elections at the state and local level. Because I've seen it, and that's why I live here now. So yes, that is a problem. Up front, speaking of California refugees, one of my fellow refugees.
Well, I want to congratulate you for shedding light on this issue. I think it's a terribly important issue.
So Mark, give us a brief ad. Who are you?
Okay,
We didn't hear who you are.
All right,
Why are you an interesting person?
Well, I'm not sure I am, but I'm Mark Pulliam, live in Austin, and spent 32 years in California, and am in fact a refugee, and there will be more in the future. And they're not all bad people. A lot of them are good people moving here for the right reasons. And so in the last couple of years, this issue has received more and more attention in Texas, the amount of taxpayer funded lobbying, whether it's a good idea or not, whether it should be prohibited or not. I'm not aware, I haven't studied it. Does this happen in other states? Does it happen at the same level that is happening here? And in other states, is it prohibited? Have people debated whether or not it should be prohibited? Could you put this in the context of, what is happening elsewhere?
I think it is a national problem. I had the honor of testifying before the Kansas legislature on this very issue, I think about 3 or 4 years ago. Did it remotely, though. I think I did it through Skype, saving our 501c nonprofit dollars and not traveling to Kansas myself. But they had a bill very similar to, I think, bills that have been offered in Texas before, and not too dissimilar from a bill I authored in California that naturally didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, the data I've looked at shows that about half the states roughly have some sort of prohibition, not necessarily on all taxpayer-funded lobbying. A lot of it seems to be directed at the state level, at state employees, and the issue of looking at what political subdivisions at lower level of governments are doing, that number, then it drops down to more like 10 or so states are looking at that. So
it's an interesting question. Yes.
Okay, so there's actually another layer to this in our view, because you have state agencies. I'll just take TxDOT. I'm Terry
your
Hall
name?
with Texas Turf. Yeah.
Thank you.
And so we advocate on transportation issues on behalf of taxpayers. What we see happen all the time, there's a state prohibition of state agencies using taxpayer funds to hire lobbyists. Well, they get around it because there's this little section of the statute that says unless they're being responsive to a request for information from a legislator. So we might, as constituents, go into an office, and here comes TxDOT right behind us, undoing or unraveling what the constituents are asking their representatives to do. And they claim it's, because they're asking us for being responsive to a request. But I've heard from so many representatives and lawmakers that they abuse it terribly. I mean, literally, there was a TxDOT sunset bill where TxDOT, their higher-ups, were in the conference committee. The public was not allowed in, but members of the agency were, and deciding what provisions stayed in and which ones came out. How is that not lobbying with state funds? So not only do we have to restrict TML and Texas Association of Counties and all these other local governments, we have state agencies that are horrifically abusing this as well and hurting taxpayers. So to me, I want to ask you, what about enforcement of that law? How do we get around this little hook they keep using that it's responsive to requests or not?
So, Michael, I'd like
Can we
to
just
ask,
remove that from statute?
I'd like to ask you this question because, as a lawmaker, I mean, we have this division of power, right? We have checks and balances. We've got 3 branches of government, ideally. I mean, I understand in the modern administrative state, there's probably a 4th branch now functionally of the bureaucracy. But if you look at the executive, legislative, judicial, and if the legislative is the pocketbook, basically appropriating money, raising the money that funds government, how does the legislative then perform their oversight duties without having that open line of communication with the executive? I mean, is there some way to put some fence posts around that behavior so they're not unduly influencing legislation?
Well, I imagine the provision you're talking about, I imagine the rationale for putting that in statute, and I haven't seen, I think I looked over it briefly yesterday. 556, the government code. And I imagine the rationale was to allow for what you're talking about, right? For departments to advise. Does it specifically use that word lobbying? I mean, is it an exception to?
They're not allowed to use it to lobby or influence legislation.
Okay.
So they can't hire lobbyists, they can't influence legislation, but it's
Mhm.
is unless they're being responsive to a lawmaker's questions or
Sure.
inquiries or whatever. But if you watch TxDOT or other state agencies do the same thing,
Mhm.
in a committee, testify for or against a bill, it will deep six a bill just like that.
Yeah,
They're
you know, it's a very complicated question because it's like we were saying earlier, even though these agencies testify on the bill, you can usually figure out where they fall on the bill. And I'm not sure if paying lip service to their neutrality is really helping.
I think if you see an abuse of what I would characterize as a loophole, going on, then you find some legislator who's willing to carry a bill for you to fix it. And I mean, that's kind of how this thing happens, right? I mean, we see a bunch of state agencies are finding a workaround to something that we really don't want them doing, and they're doing it. And so then you find, and there's some good state senators and reps out there who I'm sure if you brought this issue to them would say, let's fix this.
But isn't that what the law already says? You see what I'm saying? We're just keep trying to pass a bill to do the
Right.
same thing that the law already restricts them from
So I
doing
think
in a lot
another
of
thing
ways.
that lawmakers can do is they certainly need to exercise their authority as elected representatives to call up, for example, the head of the agency and say, look, I don't appreciate your employees who are being paid for with money that I vote to appropriate arguing against my bill, right? I mean, that needs to happen. There needs to be more calling of account for inappropriate behavior. And I think it goes to your point, this isn't about a bill, this is about culture, this is about governmental culture. What is allowed, what isn't allowed, what is accepted, what's not accepted, and we need to call bad behavior and make sure there's consequences for it. Question over here. I'm wondering if that's a city employee out there.
I'm a state employee, actually. I work for State Rep Matt Krause. This question isn't on Matt's behalf, but you mentioned the bill. I really am curious. The Senate bill that passed through the Senate, like you mentioned, it didn't pass through the House. I'm not an expert on this issue, but just was curious, did that bill contain all the substantive provisions that you guys think would essentially make this issue right? Or are there additional things that would need to happen in future sessions?
No, that bill, it was a disclosure bill, essentially. And so what it did was it required a massive number of the things that we've been talking about up here. And I'm not going to go through the litany of them. I'd have to pull my notes up to pull through the litany of them. But it essentially required disclosure of all of these kinds of expenditures. It did not actually contain a prohibition on the behavior. It was purely a disclosure bill. I think we need to go a step further and actually prohibit the taxpayer-funded lobbying. That would be my position. But
So to the issue of disclosure, the way I was able to come up with the estimate of about up to $41 million that was spent through near the end of this last session on it was by going through the campaign ethics disclosure statements and looking then at the payments to private lobbyists from different public entities, and it provides a band. It basically says, more than 15,100 and less than 25,000. And so then I took the midpoint of that and just added it up on a gigantic spreadsheet. What is missing, though, is the ability to easily go through and look at basically the check stubs, if you will, and to figure out exactly how much money is being spent for this purpose. And not only with the state government, but with the federal government as well, because there's money spent to lobby the federal government. Even though your congressional delegation is certainly going to have the phone call with a local school district person or a local city council. They're going to listen to them, of course they are. It's called representative government.
You talked about, just really quick, you talked about the ethics filings. I was looking at those, and the ranges at which these lobbyists report vary greatly, right? So you don't have to say I spent $83,000. You say I spent somewhere in between $50,000 and $100,000. You were being nice by choosing the midpoint because I was just assuming they
Yeah.
spent the whole $100,000 when I was doing my numbers.
Any questions on this other side? I don't want to ignore the other side of the room, but you've been very quiet over here. So nothing. We probably have time for maybe 2 more questions. Yes, nothing over here. Okay. Back on the voluble side of the room. Well, so we have 2 people who want a second bite of the apple. Okay, we'll go with the anesthesiologist, because if he gave me the wrong dose, he would kill me. So we'll go first with the anesthesiologist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a great discussion, by the way. So just one more comment. You know, it was mentioned particularly about state entities. I'm on faculty at McGovern Medical School, and you know, one thing that we see happen, like when we have people from institutions coming to testify that may have ulterior motives that aren't very clear. For example, scope of practice, something that comes up almost every other legislative cycle, and you'll have someone from a nursing school come up and say, oh, you know, we should expand scope of practice. And they're doing it on behalf of the nursing school because that is something that could potentially be beneficial to their graduates, but the same token is not necessarily something I want my taxpayer money for supporting, particularly if there's less safety for patients, for example. So, you know, there's always going to be people that work at institution, and I try to be very careful about that when I go to Austin. But is there any sort of mechanism to call that to account too, like we were talking about with other officials?
Do you know, so I was under the impression that most of these groups came out of their own pocketbook, right? If that's not the case, then it's definitely something we need to look into, because if those are public entities and
Right, you could be violating existing law if those are public entities paying for that transportation. So that is something that probably needs to be looked at. Absolutely.
Yeah, even if it were, though, remember, a lot of these entities have associations, basically trade associations, where, you know, nominally they're paying dues, but really most of the revenue comes from the vendors that serve that industry that buy overpriced ad space to help create a kind of a slush fund for these sorts of activities. So, I mean, the challenge is that there's an old saying that no matter how you restrict money in politics, that it's always going to find a way to influence. Because look at it this way. The legislature, we know that lobbyists, public entities, probably spent close to $41 million, maybe more, probably more in the last session, to influence the legislature on behalf of cities and counties and special districts. The reason why that money was spent is because we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars worth of public funds that could be spent one way or the other. And so it's a good return on investment. That's why they do it. And that's why it's important to have more disclosure, to close down these pathways, and more importantly, why it's important for you all as Texans to get more involved with ensuring that the legislature knows what you think about these issues, because you're the ones that are the most important. Thank you so much for coming here today and participating in our panel. Thank you.